So as you know, we are now traveling down the sanitation service chain, and today's focus is zooming into access and construction. But I think, as we already heard from the few contributions to the session today, this also requires us to talk about the use and maintenance of sanitation facilities. So what I want to do is to first talk a little bit about who lacks access and why, so contextualizing that, and then pay a little bit of time towards who builds, manages, and maintains. In other words, whose responsibility is it to construct and assure that people have access to sanitation? And I think, again, already from the couple of contributions we had in the session today, it's clear that it's not just about a piece of infrastructure or a sanitation facility. And we will again talk a little bit about the kind of practices, the norms, the taboos that surround the construction and access to sanitation. Just want to put into context who lacks access and why, and what some of the challenges are. So as we probably all know, those lacking access in urban areas are primarily based in informal, low-income areas. And rapid urbanization is a major challenge that makes it difficult to enhance access. So we can see that utilities not only have to deal with meeting the existing shortfall, but also meeting new demand because of more people being born in cities or moving to cities or urban areas. In the context of informal settlements, we also know that informal development and densification often results in the fact that there is a lack of space for proper sanitation provision. But there are also a number of other factors that increase the need to consider perhaps alternative sanitation solutions. And this, as we can see from the picture here, which is from Wanza, is linked, for instance, to the topography or the terrain of settlements where sanitation is lacking. Last week, we also mentioned the issue of high water tables, which make some sanitation solutions unfeasible. It's also important here to raise or to put emphasis on the role of tenure security and how that influences people's decision about sanitation investments. And there is a clear gender dimension here, and I will talk a little bit more about that in a second. And as already mentioned last week, lack of sanitation facilities also often increases climate vulnerability. At the same time, sanitation improvements can be a key component to help communities and cities to adapt to climate change. I want to now pick up a little bit on the discussion of grid versus off-grid sanitation. And in many places across urban Africa, we see that underground sewerage networks are limited in reach and therefore only serve a minority of inhabitants. And usually those are the better offs living in cities. And you can see the limited extent of the sewer network for Freetown, Beira, and Mwanza shown on the screen. And those to be served or that still have to be served often tend to be far away from the grid, which means that network extensions are not an immediate option, if an option ever at all. So in fact, last week, we also emphasized that priority is often given to grid investments, while the shortfall is majorly in off-grid areas. What we also can see from a lot of research that has been done around that is that most donor funds tend to be spent on capital investments for the grid, with little that is going towards the operation and the maintenance of those facilities. And I think we heard clearly from the case of Beira, where the benefits of such large investments have been short-lived. And of course, off-grid sanitation improvements are rarely funded through these funds. If you take a look at the quote that is on the right, you can see this is taken from a report on financing urban sanitation in Africa, and is an example from Dakar in Senegal, and it basically shows two things. The first one is that centralized sewage systems are far more expensive than off-grid sanitation. And the second one is that centralized sewage systems are highly subsidized, with costs mainly borne by subsidized utilities, while off-grid sanitation is not. And here we find that households are covering the costs often entirely. And this is something that we have also witnessed quite a bit across the case studies of the OVERDUE project. So let's then think a little bit about who is responsible, who funds, builds, manages, and maintains sanitation infrastructure. There is a clear divide and mismatch between grid and off-grid sanitation, with diverse and often fragmented governance arrangements. I only have a few minutes left, so I just want to zoom into the off-grid sanitation situation. And here we can see that what happens at construction has also implications for access, but also for the rest of the service, sanitation service chain. And it's about much more than just the availability of infrastructure. It's about the diverse people, their practices and experiences, and these are shaped depending on who they are and where they live and work. So it matters whether you are male or female, a tenant or a landlord, a sanitation user or worker, and whether you access household sanitation facilities or rely on shared or public facilities. There is a multitude of largely informal sanitation workers that are needed to construct and manage off-grid sanitation, both with regards to household toilets, but also shared facilities. We have uncovered a large stigmatization of sanitation work, and this is highly gendered. So different sanitation workers in our research shared that they or their families feel ashamed to disclose how they earn an income, and particularly female sanitation workers have been stigmatized, while, for instance, sometimes when it comes to sanitation technicians, for example, is perfectly acceptable for men to carry out this job, but not so much for women. But there's also a naturalized gender division of sanitation roles and responsibilities within paid and unpaid sanitation work. And what we also found in our research is the persisting taboos and social norms that impact sanitation practices, particularly of women. And just want to share two examples before closing. For instance, women in Abidjan shared it's not appropriate for women to be heard or seen using the toilet. And in Tanzania, it's deemed unacceptable to share toilets with in-laws. And there are also various taboos around menstruation that might put women to adopt dangerous or unhealthy sanitation practices.